All right, we're going to get rocking and rolling here. Welcome to our webinar today, where we're going to talk about looking for threats through statistical outliers and statistical analysis. So a few housekeeping items off the top, as some of you might have heard already. Number one, if you lose your connection or you need to step away from this webinar, it will be recorded and you're going to receive a copy of that recording at the end. Number two, you're all on mute, so don't worry, you're not going to make any accidental mistakes in talking to your microphone so that the whole world hears it. But that also means that you can use that question and answers box or the chat box. I prefer question and answer box if you need to ask anything or if you're having trouble hearing or anything, and I can address that. So please feel free to use that both throughout the webinar and towards the end when we get more into the questions and answers. We're only going to run this for about 15 to 30 minutes usually, again, depending on how much coffee I've had this morning. It really depends on how long the webinars will run. And more than anything, we really want to thank you for taking the time to come today. We know you're all busy people. You all have things to do, so we really appreciate your time, and we certainly intend to make the most out of it. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about doing some statistical analysis using the Snow platform from Arcadia. Now, how we do this is actually through this interface that you all should be seeing now, which is called Snowboard. Snowboard is our window into all of the data that our Snow agents are collecting every minute of every day across our customer networks, and we even monitor our own networks, and of course we monitor our test network that you're going to see today. So for those of you who are new, I'm going to walk you through a little bit about how Snowboard works and kind of how the data comes in and how we look at it, because that's important. But also I'm going to show you how we move into more statistical analysis and how we can use it as well to look at the network at a higher level and also look at how infections might be spreading. So hopefully you all can see my screen at this point. If not, we have major technical problems. But what you should be seeing is this kind of list of investigations. And this is exactly what myself and the other hunters on Arcadia do every single day, as well as some of our customers, is we get into Snowboard and we take a look at what's going on our customer networks. And each one of these is what's called an investigation. That's pretty easy to understand. If we take a look at just picking one here, what this investigation gets triggered by is something that our agent has identified that looks suspicious. So this could be any number of things. In this case, there's process hollowing, which we covered in a previous webinar. I encourage you to go back and watch that. And we also see some suspicious threads. So this investigation is going to embody a lot of information, and it also includes a lot of tools that are useful for both hunting as an individual and hunting as a team. So one of the things we'll often do is we'll use the logging mechanism where we can actually say, hey, this is Justin, I pulled down a binary for analysis in IDA. That's going to tell my other coworkers, hey, there's no point in me pulling down this binary. Justin's taking a look at it. I'll put my notes back in, and we can have a conversation about what's going on in this particular investigation. This is also useful so that customers can actually collaborate with us so they can see what we're doing, maybe even provide input. Lots of our customers are actually really technical people who understand a lot of what we're talking about. They might also be seeing things on other hosts that they'll pop in and say, hey, are you guys noticing this? Or I saw this on another host, or I saw something else, throw out an alert. So this is really useful. The other thing that's really powerful when working in this environment is the notion of clustering. So we have the ability as a team to look at a particular investigation and look at some of the data points, which we're going to get into, and say, well, how can we actually save ourselves some time in the future by writing these powerful clustering rules that will automatically say, okay, if we see this particular process at this particular time on this host, in the future, we want to pull that into this investigation so that this investigation can kind of become the main point for investigating similar pieces of information. This is really powerful. This is so that we're not duplicating work continually, investigating the same things over and over. So this is exactly what this clustering tab is for. And again, we're probably going to do a webinar just on clustering at some point in the future. The commands panel here, you're going to see a bit of it in action later, but we have the ability to speak to any one of our agents in the network and get them to perform tasks for us. So this could be anything from retrieving a file to retrieving memory or performing other forensic operations. And this is really powerful because it allows us to kind of expand our intelligence collecting and say, okay, if we have something going on this host, we want to pull back some evidence or we want to collect some things. We also have the ability to trigger some of that stuff automatically, which you're going to see very shortly. So the next thing down is the leads list. So just like if a police officer was investigating a homicide, you have an investigation, which is the actual murder itself, and then you have the leads that are coming in, which are all the pieces of information and people that contribute to that investigation. And it is much the same thing in Snowboard. That is kind of logically how we think as humans, and we've applied that here. We say, okay, we have these events that have happened around this time on this host. Let's pull them all into this investigation so we have a deeper view of what's going on this particular machine around this time. So we have the ability to look at these leads individually, and we can see that each one of them has slightly different information. So we see process hollowing on the first 3 or 4 leads, and then we see a suspicious thread found at the bottom. By clicking on either one of these, what we're able to do is actually see highly detailed technical information about what is going on and why that lead was included in the investigation. So what this means is that we have looked at, okay, what is going on here and what is relevant. And so we also have the ability then to capture this information and begin to say, well, what else can we look at around this time, or what else can we look at from other tools? So if we look at the top here, we actually have the ability to also do some automated forensic collection. So this means that when this particular lead was brought in, it automatically triggered some follow-up forensic work to happen. And this means reading some process memory to extract this particular thread that was injected. So we've actually extracted the code out of memory so that we can now do analysis on it. We've also triggered a process memory map, which is going to tell us here's what the memory layout looked like for this process at the time that this was triggered. And this is really useful for us because it gives us that information. And as you know, malware has the ability to clear memory or kill itself and do things very quickly. And so we want to collect as much evidence and as much intelligence as we can, as fast as we can, so that we have all the information we need in order to do some analytical work, because once it's destroyed, it's destroyed. And so that is really key. And so all of this is rolled into this lead. Now, one of the other powerful things we have the ability to do is say, well, if we have this particular event that's occurred now, what's happened around the time of this event? And by clicking on these little arrows right here, we actually pull up a really neat thing called the event stream. And this is all of the events that that agent has collected around the time that that particular lead came in. So you can see that we've triggered there's some TCP connections. We've seen the thread injection here. We see some more TCP connections. So we're also looking at what is the behavior both before and after this lead has come in. And that's going to tell us potentially the infection vector. So are we seeing Internet Explorer being run, and then we're seeing some Russian malware domain being accessed, and then we see all of a sudden now we have a thread injection and a bunch of suspicious stuff happening after that. It helps us to work backwards to figure out, okay, where did this happen? What occurred? Are we seeing a known vulnerability that's being used against one of our customers, or did they download a binary that they shouldn't have? So that really helps us to figure this stuff out. And this is a really powerful and useful feature. Again, we could probably do an entire webinar just on the event stream, but we live and die going through our investigations, looking at this stream to figure out what's going on around the time of that infection or the time of that suspicious behavior. So this is kind of the main investigation view. Again, this will give you kind of the basis for where a lot of our investigations start. But today, of course, we are looking at how do we look at the network or look at hosts at a larger level and say, what is a statistical outlier? Or can we look at things that are suspicious just based on the fact that their reputation count is low, meaning we haven't seen them around a lot. We haven't seen a particular binary get executed a lot around the network. And how we do that is through the host view. And I already have a host view loaded up here. And so this is an actual host view for any one of our agents. So we have the ability to pull this information up for any one of our agents across the entire network. And this is really useful because when we're looking at infections or potential outbreaks, we also are going to stand back and look at, well, are they targeting a particular Windows version? So in this case, it's a Windows 7 machine. Are they targeting a particular subnet inside of the network? Is there a way that it can be contained that way? And so this host information, although granular, meaning we can drive down into one host, it also allows us to kind of look at that 30,000 foot view and say, are we seeing commonalities or patterns or are we seeing an exploit being used against only a certain version of Windows or a certain set of users? And this is really useful. The other thing to note is that our customers actually have the ability, when our agents are deployed, to segment networks based on utility. So inside of our Snow system, we have the ability to say anything in this particular subnet is actually the executive team. So it's the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and we can segment those away from the development teams, away from the servers. And so that also allows us to look at what's going on in a particular subnet, what's going on with a particular group of people. And those logical divisions are really important when you're looking at kind of higher level statistical analysis of threats. So if we start to take a look at what's available inside the host view, one of the cool things is we have all the last events from that host. So it is literally a running tally, a running audit trail of here's all the things that's been going on in that particular host, starting with the newest stuff at the top, going oldest down. And so we can see all the events, and that means, unique DNS requests. We can see that we ran some commands, or we can see a code identity event, which means that our agent has actually looked at a binary and extracted its code signing certificate to take a look at it. And this is really useful for us because we can see kind of a high level view of what's going on that particular machine. We can look at the event stream again, which is what we looked at more specifically to an investigation, but we can do the same for a host. Or we can begin to drive into the host objects. Now, inside of the Snow platform, one of the coolest features is the fact that we have this object database. It's this big database of all the processes, the files, everything we see across an entire network all gets rolled into this database so that we can actually do analytical work on it. And that also means that, as you'll see later, we can query for very specific certain pieces of information so that we can dig into them. This object database is extremely useful, and again is something that threat hunters find incredibly useful when they're digging into a particular process and they want to say, where else have we seen this, or they want to cross-reference a particular binary against VirusTotal. But you're also going to see that some of the statistical analysis here is already done for us, and you can already see this very handy outliers link. So I have loaded it up in another tab, and we're going to click on that. So what the outliers is if you've never heard the term before, is basically anything that is statistically outside of the normal. So if you've ever looked at those graphs where there's a whole bunch of little dots following a line on a graph, and then there's that one dot up all lonely to the left in the top left of a graph, that's an outlier. That's the typical outlier. If you Google for graph outlier, that's typically what you'll see. So it's stuff that doesn't fit the normal baseline, which is of course where a lot of us live and die in the security world. Is we want to look at what is the baseline, what are things that we see all the time, and what are things that don't fit within that baseline. Now, the beautiful thing about Snowboard is it actually boils this down into something that's really easy for you to look at and understand. We can look at something as simple as the number of locations that we've seen a particular binary or DLL and say, hey, if we have 1,000 machines that are all be actively monitored on this particular subnet, and we only ever see this file once on all of those machines, we probably want to go take a look at it because this is statistically unusual. And how we know that is we can actually reverse sort this and begin to take a look at, well, what are things that are common? So we can see common DLLs that are being used. We can see common processes the further we scroll down. So things like SVC host, which is a critical Windows process that runs on every machine. We can see, hey, there's over 1,300 examples of this particular process running on this subnet. That's not that suspicious, right? So this is really critical, and this is often where we will start when we're looking at what's going on a host from an outliers perspective. Is anything that's got a low number of locations in it is a potential hit for a piece of malware or other threat that could be analyzed. And so we're looking at things like, while the Chrome updater, this was only executed twice, could it be, for example, that this is just a brand new version of Chrome that's being rolled out? Well, very easily you have the ability to query the database, as you will see very shortly, to actually look and say, well, what is this binary? Where have we seen it before? And what's relevant about it? So this is one of the very first things and the fundamental things we do when we're looking at statistical analysis is the outliers, and this is really critical. Now, what else can we actually look at? So even if we identify that one of these things looks suspicious, or hey, this low number of execution counts. For example, well, we see malware demo windows. If you ever see malware demo windows running on one of your machines, you typically want to go look at it unless you're doing one of these webinars. So what else can we take a look at? Well, another thing we can look at are the auto runs. So anything that is going to do some form of persistence is usually, most commonly, going to target the auto runs keys in the registry and say, okay, every time this machine boots up or every time this user logs in, we want to make sure that our malware continues to run, right? That's really critical. So when we're looking at auto runs, again, we see scrolling down, we see things that are really common. We see things that are started up all the time. And then looking at this particular host, we see that there's some things that look pretty strange. So when there's only 4 executions out of a network of 1,000+ machines, that's pretty strange to see something in the auto runs that is only available on 4 machines. And again, if you have some logical separation in your network, maybe it's not that abnormal if you only have 4 machines, because then it would mean that that's statistically irrelevant. It's 100% of them. In this case, we have over 1,000 machines. It is absolutely something that stands out. So what can we actually do to say, okay, what is this thing and what's going on? Well, the cool thing is we can just highlight this path and you'll see this little flyout come up down here. We can click on the bullseye and say search in objects. And I'll close our little thing here. All right, so what this has done is actually queried the database and said, okay, we want to know more about this particular path. And we actually have a couple of things that have come back from the database. One is a file path. So it's saying, hey, we recognize this file path from somewhere. And so we can look at it and say, okay, there was 4 locations, interesting. We don't have any associated parents or children for this particular file. But then we can actually see the hosts where this particular path showed up. So this immediately is going to, for us hunters, we're going to look at this and say, uh-oh, there's 4 other machines here as it showed in the locations. We should probably include these, roll these into the investigation because they too may have some suspicious behavior going on, or they might already be in our investigation list and we want to roll the stuff all together into one larger investigation. This might mean that we have a bit of an outbreak on our hands. Or again, if this was 4 executives, it could also mean that there's a spear phishing campaign that has been successful against all 4 executives, and we want to go take a look at it. So this is really useful that we're able to query this database, take a look at it and say, well, what is this thing? Where are we finding it? And that also gives us the ability to go and take a look at what else we potentially need to do to contain the threat. Same thing with auto runs, being able to click on that object in the database, look at the auto runs information and say, okay, where else is it also in the auto runs? Well, we see it's the same 4 hosts. So not only are we seeing the same file path showing up, we're also seeing that it's also persisted. So it's also inserted itself into the auto runs on these 4 hosts. We probably want to go take a look at those 4 machines double hard now because this is really, really suspicious. So once we've reached this kind of consensus that something very strange is going on, how do we actually begin to react to this? So what do we actually do for next steps? Well, as I mentioned before, one of the great things is that we can actually highlight this path and we can use it and just say, okay, we want to go out and retrieve this file just by using our commands box down here. I'm not going to do that today. So we can reach out, we can grab that file back. We can, of course, depending on the customer, we can begin to work with them to say, hey, I think there's an incident here. Let's start talking about implementing your incident response plan, assuming you have one. Hopefully everyone listening here today has one. Or a number of other things. We can begin reverse engineering, taking a look at that particular file. We can also begin to look at other things that are going on that host. So this is where we will also look at, okay, well, what have we seen any weird domains coming up in the last while or at all time that looks suspicious or don't seem to fit? Yep, there's some weird stuff we're seeing here. What is going on? Often we'll also see stuff like, people trying to access Tor, Onion, like hidden services through a regular web browser, and we're often alerted and like, that's really weird. What is this? What is this person up to? When it's 9 o'clock in the morning at their day job. So stuff like that we're able to actually look at and say, well, what other things are actually contributing to the overall kind of threat or the overall reason why we would raise kind of the alert level for this particular organization or these sets of hosts. And this is the great thing, is that we can dive down into any one of these things on a host, begin to do some statistical analysis on it, and then bring that back into more of the investigative viewpoint. So we can always start from an investigative point and work our way up, or we can start from a statistical standpoint and work our way down to an actual investigation. And often what we'll find is that customers tell us, here are our critical machines, or they might even put them into that logical subnet. And we're able to say, okay, let's go out and just start looking at outliers. And this is something myself and Mick and other hunters on the team will do. And we'll look at it and say, okay, well, here's some interesting outliers on these machines. What's interesting or not. Well, here, this is a weird PowerShell execution that we don't see anywhere else. Let's take a look at that PowerShell script and see what it is. Oh, okay, it's a homegrown sysadmin, who's written a thing to kind of purge a mail queue or whatever it is. But we have the ability to immediately look at those things and start that investigation from 30,000 feet and begin to drive downwards into, okay, how do we actually acquire some evidence here and begin some reverse engineering, or looking at, what else is going on that machine. So that's kind of the beauty of having this data at your fingertips, is that you can work from both ends. Something that's been triggered in an investigation, work your way up to, let's look at the statistical analysis of this to see if it's spread, or to see if there's other things that are causing it. You can also start from the other side and work down towards opening an investigation, begin rolling some leads together to figure out what's actually going on. So, as promised, we've covered the main topics for this webinar. It's been about 21 minutes, which is actually a long time for me to talk during these things. Now is a great opportunity for any of you to ask questions about both the statistical analysis capabilities of Snow, but also, of course, if you have other questions about Snow that you'd like me to answer at this time, or Snowboard in general, or if there's something that I can demonstrate on screen with the remaining time, that will be something that I'd be happy to do. So feel free to use that question and answer box. I'm already seeing some questions coming in now. So what are all of the commands that are available? So I can actually show you, we have a commands panel that I can take you to. So we actually have a whole bunch of different commands that we can run. As you can see, we can get files, we can get just information about files, we can move them around, we can rename them if necessary, we can retrieve handles and strings, we can deal with threads. So we covered some of this in a previous webinar with thread injection. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can do here directly on the agent. And you also, which we've done in the past, where working with a customer where they have a particular tool that they like for doing forensics on, like grabbing a process snapshot. So for example, if you're somebody who's used volatility in the past, and we could actually push that binary over, execute it to get the forensic snapshot we want, and then pull back the binary and pull back the forensic snapshot with it. So it's actually a really flexible, a flexible system, and a nice way to be able to use these commands and be able to talk to those remote agents. All right, so what else do we have? All right, hopefully you're welcome. Hopefully that helped answer that. All right, so I had another question for, can you see the outliers for only modules, for example? No, so you can see outliers for basically anything in the database, because that location count that you see, so for example, actually a great one here is, I even have it loaded, is services. So we can actually look at things like a service name and say, well, are there any outliers in the service name? So we actually see two here that have four locations where we have a Windows licensing monitoring service and a WLMS. So at this point, we don't actually know, is that actually Windows, or is it something else that's just registered a service as that so that it can persist upon reboot. So this is also something where, this having all these objects allows us just to do this analysis very quickly and say, okay, this looks strange. We have only 4 locations for these particular services. We should probably go take a look at that and just validate that, hey, is this something new that Windows has rolled out, or is this part of a patch Tuesday, or what's going on? Hopefully that helps to answer that. Again, like I said, that's just one of the nice flexible things about this system, is the ability to kind of do this analysis on all different kinds of objects inside of the database. Okay, so I had another question about, do the commands work on Linux? And so, yes, the commands will work on Linux. So we do support Linux as well. In our monitoring, of course, a lot of us use Linux, or we use Linux VMs to do some of our work. And we monitor those machines just like we do our Windows machines. So we get alerts and we get investigations that come up and we look into them. Of course, Linux has different problems than Windows. So we definitely have different ways of looking at the data. And of course, there are certain things that quite obviously that Windows does that Linux does not, and vice versa. So we actually have different investigations for each platform as well, depending on what kind of behavior is going on the host. So hopefully that helps to answer that question. All right. Does anyone else have any further questions? I think I've gotten through most of them so far. I'll give everyone about 30 seconds. We are getting close to that 30-minute mark. All right. Don't be shy. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I've seen a couple of questions come in that are fairly kind of more extensive. What I'm going to do for those of you who've just asked a couple more longer questions, what we'll do is we'll actually follow up with you over email because otherwise I think folks are going to have to hear me drone on for about half an hour. So don't worry, we're going to get to you. We're going to send you an email to follow up on those larger questions. And again, the recording is going to go out. If you have any questions for us, please don't hesitate to contact myself or another team member at Arcadia. You're going to find that we're all very friendly Canadian and Lithuanian folk, and we're very happy to help you and happy to answer questions. And we love this stuff, so we like talking shop with people as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And again, I want to thank everybody for coming out and hanging in there for almost 30 minutes. We really appreciate your time. We know it's extremely valuable, and we really look forward to chatting with you some more, seeing you on the next webinar. And thanks again. I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to stay online for a few minutes if there's any follow-up questions or anyone wants to chat with me, and then I'm going to cut the webinar in a couple of minutes. So thank you again very much, everyone, for everything. I really appreciate it. I know the team at Arcadia appreciates it, and we look forward to talking to you again.